Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Tom Keene, along with Paul Sweeney. Join us each day for insight from the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. We welcome all of you across America and around the world, and particularly all of you listening in India now, to, without question, our Bloomberg Conversation of the Day on the historic moment for the Indian people. Rajan is at Booth School. He's at Booth School. His financial book on the crisis of 07-08 won every award, Fault Lines. He is one of our great financial professors and, of course, a former head of a central bank of India. Far more importantly, as always, Rajan out front, he has a book he is delivering, Breaking the Mold, on his India. It will be a definitive 270 pages. Look for that from Princeton University Press shortly. Raghu, thank you so much for sending me the PDF of the book. I'm going to cut to the chase, Professor. The final sentence of your book: they cannot have any more excuses. What are the excuses Modi has now, and what does he need to move India to a new prosperity?
Well, we have an election. The results have been coming out, and I think it's a splendid result because it tells the government it needs to change course. The old course was unviable, and we can talk about that. Of course, markets seem to be disappointed. We can talk about that also, why markets are reacting negatively. But I think what is happening today is really, in the long run, really good for India because it forces India to choose a different course from the one it has been on, a course which has led to much wider unemployment and distress than needed in the country.
Is this an election result that you see will bring the technocratic and elite South together with a more emotional and historic North? Does it bring the polarity of India together, or do we have a more separate India in 2026?
No, it's actually a win for democracy, and that's good for India because what democracy does is it allows the different paths to essentially express themselves and to negotiate. The problem earlier was India was trending towards a more autocratic country, a country with one leader who had a larger than life image. And that, unfortunately, meant that the BJP leadership wasn't listening to the economic news on the ground that people were actually suffering hardship, wasn't listening to the broader sense that, the weaponization of various instruments of the government to put, opposition party leaders in jail was simply not gelling. And it would have taken India down a course which was ruinous in the longer run, maybe in the short run beneficial to the big business groups. And that's why the market is reacting adversely. But I think this is good.
Rajan with us with the Booth School Chicago. We welcome all of you on YouTube worldwide and particularly in South Asia. My colleague Damian Sassauer to Professor Rajan.
Professor Rajan, you have mentioned the concept of an authoritarian democracy and how India is moving into that sort of bucket. Talk to us a little bit about what this election means for India and what it means for Narendra Modi and some of his policies on labor and whatnot.
So I think the key number to look at in this election is the BJP's own seats in parliament. They almost surely will fall short of a majority, which means that they have to actually take the support of other parties, convince them to stay on board, which means they have to be much more sensitive to a broad-based set of policies. Now, the BJP has done some very good things during its stint in power. For example, it has improved the investment in infrastructure. And you can see roads, airports, highways becoming much better in India. That's good. However, what it has not articulated is a sensible policy for broad-based employment. And that almost surely requires policies on human capital, how to skill up the workforce, how to bring industry together with universities and so on to get people jobs. So the frustration with the BJP has been mass unemployment, which is, in an authoritarian regime, they simply don't even acknowledge the fact that unemployment has been growing and is especially amongst the youth. So what this election has done is essentially given them a cold shower of reality, that people are not happy with your policies. And that will force, if the BJP does come back to power with after negotiating with allies, it will force policies which are broader, more inclusive, and more sensitive to the needs of the people. That's a good thing.
This morning, an extended interview with Rajan of the Booth School, Chicago. For those joining in America, a shock result, or beginning of results, I should say, in a Delhi election assumed to be dominant for Mr. Modi, and it was decidedly less so. My colleague, Damian Sassower.
Professor Rajan, I want to take you back to your former role as Director of Research at the IMF. You're familiar with workers' remittances, the role they play in India. I mean, the role they play globally, 860 million of remittances in 2023. India is 15% of that. Talk to us about what this election means for the diaspora outside of India, about the flows of capital into India. Is this going to change things at all?
Well, I think it can actually be good news, both from the perspective, remittances will continue regardless of who's in power. This is more, a lot of money coming from the Middle East, some from the United States and Europe, for people to their families. And that will continue. That there's no reason why that would be disrupted. What is interesting, however, is foreign direct investment has been slowing into India over the last couple of years. Some people argue that one of the reasons it has been slowing is that people are worried about arbitrary government policy, to the extent that a more democratic dispensation at the center creates more stability about government policies. Especially, it limits the weaponization of the tax authorities, of the investigative authorities. Business actually will feel more comfortable. I hope, and I think it is quite possible that private investment, which has also been on the down, as well as foreign direct investment, could pick up slowly as it sees policies emerge, which are more comforting.
Professor, within your new book, Breaking the Mold, and I guess the answer is for every central bank, the raging vogue now is to pull climate change into some form of monetary policy mandate from whatever the nation is. Climate change is reality in India. New Delhi today, I believe, a high of 111, 114 Fahrenheit. Who's counting? Professor, what does India do and what does Modi do to immediately break the mold on a climate change out of control?
Well, this is precisely what the book is about. Can India afford to become another China? Does the world have room for another China becoming a manufacturing giant? And that was the direction the Modi government was trying to go in, offering massive subsidies to capital-intensive manufacturing. And the reality is that China is already there. There is very little place for another manufacturing giant, especially given the protectionism that's rife in the world. But India has a card up its sleeve. It actually is doing far better in services exports, which is much greener, much more sustainable. And you're seeing a huge growth in skilled services exported to the rest of the world, whether it's telemedicine, consulting, chip design, lots of new areas opening up. India accounts for 5% of global trade there. That's good.
How do you unify a nation with over 20 languages? We in the United States are in a panic. I mean, there's two languages in Chicago, the Cubs and the White Sox. That's a different story. But Raghu, how do you unify towards a new India around 20 disparate languages?
Tom, it's more than that. It's 20 official languages, which means they have enough people speaking it. But there are 600 additional dialects and languages. It's a vast, complicated country. And the only way it's unified is through democracy, because democracy allows each community a voice. You talked about 2026 in India. That's when the parliamentary seats get reapportioned, when there will be a move to have new seats in parliament for the more populous areas. That has to be done by consensus. And what I'm so glad about is that it will be done by consensus because democracy has reestablished itself in India, and they will have to negotiate how that reapportionment helps. So India is more politically stable as a result of this election, is also going to be a greater friend to the democracies of the world.
Damien, I know one of your focuses is on India, Russia, and of course it goes back to Nehru's visit in 1955 to Russia and all the responses through the 60s of John Kenneth Galbraith and Kennedy trying to reaffirm an American presence from a distance.
That's absolutely right. And Professor Rajan, I'd really like to hear your opinion on the relationship between India and Russia. Obviously, they've been a big consumer of Russian barrels of Russian oil. And if you look at the 10-year and the correlation between the Indian 10-year and Brent crude, it is pretty strong and has been since 2000. So talk to us a little bit about that relationship, India and Russia.
Well, India sort of tilted towards Russia when the U.S. tilted away from India. India and the United States were quite friendly in the 60s. But then, as the Bangladesh situation developed, the U.S. tilted away from India. And that's when Russia moved towards India. There was a strong friendship through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. India buys a lot of military hardware from Russia, so it has been dependent. That has changed. India increasingly is buying from the West, from France, from the United States, and that relationship is strengthening. So this is a work in process. India understands increasingly Russia is going to be dependent on China, which is unfortunately. At this point, the relationship between India and China is one of antagonism.
Raghu, I've got time for one more question. I have to interrupt and be rude. If you are called upon by Mr. Modi, will you serve the Indian people within his new government?
Well, I think that's an unlikely prospect. My sort of inclination is whenever there's a government I can agree with, I'm happy to work with them. I've always been open with advice. Let's see what happens.
Raghu, thank you so much. We're really anticipating Breaking the Mold, 270 pages from Princeton University Press. Look for that from Professor Rajan, the Booth School at Chicago. It is legendary at the University of Virginia, the largest birthday party ever in the history of the University of Virginia was on the lawn for Kate Moore. It was only 8, 9, 10 years ago. Joining us now this morning, Kate Moore from BlackRock and our global allocation team. Kate Moore, happy birthday to you.
Oh, thanks, Tom. I must say, it's great to be 29 again.
We're all working. The only one getting away with it, Kate Moore, is Damien Sassower. He's cut and chiseled and doing 36 holes on the golf course. Kate Moore, I want you to measure the level of exuberance right now. I see a lot of fancy technical studies that say we're just not as exuberant as 1999. Do you buy it?
Yeah, I don't see a huge amount of exuberance. Actually, let's just talk about exuberance over the course of 2024, right? We had gotten to a pretty excited place by the end of March. Obviously, stocks were putting up big gains. People who had been skeptics around the resilience of the U.S. economy had to throw in that towel. It seemed like everyone was afraid of being underweight or under risked. And I think a lot of that has faded. We had a tougher April. And now we've had a lot of cross currents as companies have reported earnings, some good news and some just okay news, and lots of unexpected sort of changes in the macro environment and in the policy rate expectations. So I would say we're just in a kind of a lukewarm, but not negative, but a lukewarm state at the moment.
Happy birthday, Kate. And I agree with you. Things are far more asymmetric. I mean, they're not as asymmetric. They're far more two-sided, given the move we've seen since mid-April.
Whoa. You're saying there's an asymmetry between 39 and 29? Is that what this is?
No asymmetry there whatsoever. So Ms. Moore, King Dollar's flexing its muscles yet again, right? I mean, let's be real here. I mean, this is not a U.S. exceptionalism move. This is a risk-off move. Every single currency in G10 and EM, with the exception of the pound, is now down versus the dollar year to date. Talk to us about King Dollar in the current environment.
Yeah, we've had a modest overweight to the dollar throughout the course of this year. Not a huge bet, but just kind of an expectation that U.S. economy was going to be stronger than some of our big trading partners and therefore kind of justified. But I have to say, I think there is a little bit of a risk-off element to it, as you suggest. And there is also an understanding that the U.S. economy is very resilient. And quite a lot of them, both consumer, although that's, people like to debate that, but the consumer data and the corporate data is still really strong. So, I'm not a great currency forecaster, but I wouldn't bet against the dollar, at least in the next few months.
Folks, I really want to bring this to your attention. After Damien talks to Kate Moore of BlackRock, we're thrilled to go to Delhi, and we'll speak to Derek Walbank of Bloomberg News on this stunning election. Damien?
Well, let's stay here, Kate. Let's stay with the U.S. Let's stay with U.S. equities, right? I mean, we've had some pretty big moves in telco and IT year to date. Do we lean into that? I mean, if we had this risk-off move, if things are sort of settling in here, I mean, is this a buying opportunity?
Yeah, Damien, one of the things I will say is I love that the leadership this year is really being driven by fundamentals. I mean, I know there are skeptics out there saying this run can't continue. And yet the companies that are performing the best are those that are putting up earnings during their earnings reporting, have affirmed guidance and oftentimes raised guidance and set higher expectations. These are companies on a really solid path, in some cases on a secular path separate from the business cycle. We're not in a position where people are just kind of hyping up or speculating on what may happen in the future. This technology is here today. These companies are delivering revenues and they're printing cash. So because of that, I would not fade the leadership of these big cap tech anytime soon.
Yeah, but Kate, I mean, value and quality are both down as a strategy year to date, right? I mean, I think it's been the low vol factor. I mean, I'm not going to get into all that because everybody calculates these indices a different way, but equity trend, I mean, that's up 4% year to date. I mean, there seem to be, some technicals at work here, no?
Yeah, there are a lot of technicals. And actually, we pay very close attention to positioning and sentiment to try and time our entry and exit into different positions.
Right.
And we've been using options pretty aggressively given the vol market. We've been given a lot of opportunities to buy very cheap vol and to sell vol when we thought, it was a good opportunity.
Quickly, Kate, we're out of time, but what's the sentiment that you see among fancy people like at hedge funds on big tech? Is there a big tech bet or have they pulled away?
I think they're constructive. For the most part, of course, it's going to depend on the segment. We haven't seen huge shorting of the big names. In fact, no one wants to really stand in front of that train, whether you're a mutual fund investor, a retail investor, or a hedge fund investor. I said, as long as these companies continue to have the fundamentals, Tom, I think it's going to be an important part of your portfolio for the balance of 2024.
29 candles. Kate Moore, happy birthday. Thank you so much for joining us. Folks, we have Julie Norman on just because of time in this vamp that we just did on Stanley Cup hockey. I'm not going to harass her about Baltimore Orioles, best team in baseball. But seriously, this is the courage of Julie Norman of the University College London. She is without question one of the experts in the world on a difficult word, terrorism. And she has taken on the challenge of a book on the political history of Gaza. Professor Norman, honored to have you with us this morning. What is the political future of Gaza?
Oh gosh, Tom, I think that's the question that is on everyone's mind right now. And it's certainly the one that I think Biden is really trying to push Netanyahu on these days. Biden put out this ceasefire plan ostensibly approved by Israel, but part of that was to get the ceasefire and part of it was just to get Netanyahu starting to articulate what a day after might look like in Gaza.
Well, okay, but importantly, everybody's running for election and posturing for their domestic politics. Has the American relationship with Israel changed? Whatever the future is of Netanyahu or Prime Minister Sassauer, whatever it is, has the future changed in American-Israeli relations?
I think there's two ways to answer that. One is governmental relations with Israel. And I would say at that level, whether it's president, whether it's Congress, we still see very strong support for Israel pretty much across the board. Obviously, some exceptions within Democratic Party representatives. I think where we're seeing the shift, though, is with public opinion, obviously with young voters, young citizens in particular, and really, on the more progressive wing, with the Democratic Party more broadly now split, essentially 50-50 on leaning more sympathetic towards Palestinians and more sympathetic towards Israel. So I do think that trend is going to continue, and it's one that lawmakers will have to grapple with as, in coming years a bit more than they have in the past.
Dr. Norman, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what's going on south of the border. We had an election in Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum, Jewish, former mayor for the city, for Mexico City, a 30 percentage point win as president. Does that change Mexico's relationship with Israel at all?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Obviously very notable that she is not only the first woman, but the first Jewish person to hold that office. But she has made statements before that, that she doesn't agree with Zionism. I think she does identify, in fact, as like an anti-Zionist. So she seems to be, at least up until this point, upholding what Mexico's stance has been as being very pro-Palestine, showing their dissatisfaction with Israeli policies. But again, she's been towing the line of her predecessor up until this point, and I think we're not really sure what many of her policies are going to be in general, simply because she's been kind of walking the party line, and once she's in office, we might see some changes.
Yeah, I'm getting that same feeling, Doctor. I mean, just the uncertainty surrounding what her appointment means as president. But, let's shift gears. Let's talk about Ukraine. Let's talk about the IMF funding that they received last week. I mean, that's good news. But there's another sort of summit, another fundraiser booked with Biden. Talk to us about U.S.-Ukrainian relations. I mean, what do we expect there?
Yeah, so, I think it's a tough spot for Biden right now. Obviously, he got through the big aid package, 2 months ago. That was a very long time coming. I think that's going to be the last big infusion of military aid, at least that we see going to Ukraine anytime soon. And as the war goes on, I think Biden's getting to a point of just what is the end game here? What is all this going towards? And I think those conversations are starting to happen more.
Professor Norman, to your claim to expertise, and I'm not saying this to be snide or snarky, I think it's a serious question. Is Hamas defeated or trending toward defeated? How do you gauge that? How do you measure that?
Yeah, so this has obviously been one of Israel's main objectives, and the U.S. right now is assessing that Hamas has been sufficiently depleted in the sense that they couldn't carry out a massive military attack, they couldn't govern effectively, that sort of thing at this point. I would just say, though, Hamas is so many different actors all at once. They're a military operation, they are a political party, they're a social movement, and there's a lot of just everyday people who identify as Hamas supporters. So I don't think the movement itself is close to being wiped out. And honestly, I feel like many that after the Gaza war, they will probably be able to recruit quite effectively, or a group very similar to them will likely be able to recruit very effectively.
And Dr. Norman, talk to us a little just about, look, I can't believe I'm saying this, Russian relationships with the West, with the U.S. specifically. Talk to us a little bit about, what comes next for that country? What comes next for its relationships with the former Soviet states? I'm thinking Armenia, I'm thinking Azerbaijan, I'm thinking, quite frankly, Uzbekistan, and a lot of the sort of step out of China. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, sure. So I would say, obviously, I don't think things will change with the U.S., at least within these next 6 months, at least during the Biden presidency and with the Ukraine war. But with much of the rest of the world, including former Soviet states, including much of the global South, they have viewed this war very differently than the U.S. They have continued, trading with Russia, taking advantage of cheaper prices, and really trying to kind of straddle both lines. So globally, I feel like Russia is actually still doing fine with many states, and they will probably continue on that trajectory as anti-Western sentiment increases.
Unfortunately, Professor, we've got 45 seconds left. Since you bleed Baltimore Orioles orange, with the new ownership, should the Orioles be aggressive at the trade deadline?
Oh, I would just say I put all my trust in David Rubenstein. Like, whatever he thinks is best, I will trust him to do it. He's brought a lot of magic to Baltimore, and we're all just super excited.
Nailed it. Professor Norman just knows how to get back on the show. Julie Norman, thank you so much, and really anticipated is her most serious history about the political history of Gaza. Look for that. We'll have a substantial set of economic data at 10 o'clock, and our economic indicators always brought to you by Commonwealth, supporting more than 2,000 independent financial advisors with the solutions they need to grow a thriving business. Commonwealth, go where you grow. Visit commonwealth.com to learn more. We thank Commonwealth for their real commitment to what we're doing here as well. Joining us for a peaceful conversation, Damien, the day is
interview of the day.
Well, I don't know about the interview of the day, but let's get back to sanity and what the markets are doing. Lindsay Rosner with us, multi-sector investing, Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Which category of multi-sector is your most vibrant study right now?
The most vibrant study would be structured product. What's interesting about it isn't a market that you can just buy it all. This is a market that you absolutely have to be an active manager in. Still in CLOs, and even in commercial mortgage-backed securities.
For the mere mortals out there, identify what structured product is. It sounds like I'm buying skyscrapers that are bankrupt. What's structured product?
Hopefully not skyscrapers that are bankrupt. Although there was actually you could say a default in office space in New York recently. But really what structured product is a bucket of assets. And there is a structured overlaid that allows you to have tranching, so splitting
Parts
of the stuff, exactly. And different levels of it have different protection levels, or what they call fancy jargon credit enhancement. So if you're at the highest part of the capital structure, you're gonna have the most credit enhancement. That comes typically with less yield, less spreads.
New York Yankees are
Hey, I'm a Phillies girl, but I'll let you go with the analogy.
the
That's
Chicago
fine.
White Sox are the lowest tranche.
Lindsay, how would you respond to the argument? I mean, we all know about the $1.7 trillion private credit market, and we know about, the marketing that goes around that these are, they have tighter covenants, they're safer. Talk to us about the recoveries on first lien loans. I'm hearing that recoveries on a lot of that debt are not going to be as high as what you might otherwise find in the public markets.
Yeah, so it is really going to be collateral specific, but it goes back to, again, where I started with active management. You want a manager who is really thinking about what they're investing in. And so you can look at broad numbers like what are recovery rates? Are they going to be lower? I would say find your manager.
Right.
Find your manager who's going to do the right job. And again, the big thing that's different between public credit and private credit is that private credit is less liquid. And what I mean by that, your ability to get your money every single day, less so. In the public markets, we have daily liquidity. With that, you get a premium, by the way, though, in the private market to compensate you for that.
Lindsay, I want to channel one of your former colleagues, a chap by the name of Sam Finkelstein. Now at Citadel, I believe, a senior PM at Citadel. He joined Griffin down in Miami. A former emerging market portfolio manager. Talk to us about the role of emerging markets in a multi-asset, diversified portfolio.
Yeah, so you want to be able to look across the globe into all asset classes for opportunity. As you're both aware, it is a great opportunity set right now from a yield perspective. We've got yields that we haven't seen. There's income in fixed income. We've heard that story. But you really want to go out there and find the right place to get risk-adjusted returns because spreads are really tight. Emerging markets have been definitely an outperformer year to date. What's really driven that is that the double B and single B market has been open for financing, which is new. But we think about emerging markets as a piece of the puzzle. And there is a lot of high risk, a lot of election risk. I mean, certainly we've got election risk in the US. We don't have to get into that. But there are election risk in emerging markets as well. We are finding more opportunity actually in the US right now, and our portfolios are tilted more to the US in a multi-sector framework.
So, Lindsay, I'd love to ask you about the US elections, but we only have you for a limited amount of time.
Good,
and I
great.
need to channel Cliff Asness here. Your GSAM factor indices, we talk about carry, we talk about value, quality. What factors do you believe as an investor you should be leaning into in the current environment?
Yeah, it would be idiosyncratic factors. You want to do the right work here. If you think about it.
She got that from a Goldman Sachs.
She's been reading my research, Tom.
It's
idiosyncratic carry.
What does that mean?
An idiosyncratic factor is the kids are out of school and it's killing my bank account. Go. What do you got?
Tom, it means you got to do the homework, right? You got to figure out, is this a company that's going to pay you back? And that's really the point with bonds. Are you going to get paid back?
I'm kidding, but Damien asked a really important question, folks, because the factors shift and adjust and the weighting shift. I want to go back to one of your observations which was what's called the Money Tower, the Mutual of New York Tower on Broadway at 55 and 60. Now, the Pinatas, Blackstone, they paid $1,000 a square foot or whatever. 10 years ago, it was a different mood, and we see all these haircuts going on now. Come on, that's got to be an opportunity for you or Goldman Sachs advising big foreign money. When does the big foreign money show up to buying train wrecks like the Money Tower on 1740 Broadway?
When they can make money on the investment.
Is that now?
Well, it depends based on the forward when you think about who are the tenants, what's the leasing opportunities, just like you think about a normal corporate company. What's the forward? What's their growth opportunity? Is this an exciting place to be? What's the quality of the space that you're dealing with? If we think that it makes sense and we think that the price is right, then we can advise and help. But I think the big thing right now is that there are a lot of assets trading at the wrong price. And so if you just passively buy the world right now, you're going to get burned. You need to have an active manager to help you sort through.
Within the fancy talk world of Damian Sassower and Lindsay Rosner, the answer is you're waiting for price rationalization to occur.
That's right. Back to spreads being really tight. We're waiting for the right time to get involved. That doesn't mean we have no risk in our portfolios.
Well, you got to keep busy. You got to keep working a 10-hour workday.
There is some carry. I think what's also really interesting are their rel-val opportunities. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to give you one that's not necessarily in my bond portfolio. But right now, you can go to France and see Taylor Swift for $200. Where prices start in the U.S. $2,000 plus. Global market. Vote with your feet. Find the opportunities.
Did you see Taylor Swift in Paris?
You know what? My sister did. I'm not going to blame her for not taking me. We have a phenomenal relationship. She went with a bunch of friends. They had a great time.
Lindsay and I were thinking about going down to Argentina.
So let's get we got Mohammed Al-Arian.
Yeah.
He may have seen Taylor Swift. Muhammad may have.
Riley from St. Louis went, and Lindsay Rosner's sister went. Was everybody in the audience American in Paris? I mean, that's what it felt like.
There were many Americans there seeing
Any
Taylor.
other guests? Email in on YouTube live chat, please. Did you go see Taylor in Paris? Damian, save us with one more question.
Lindsay, you mentioned some of these less liquid segments of the fixed income market as offering value. And, when I think of those areas of the market, and obviously for you guys at GSAM, these markets, who holds the bonds, but I get a little bit fearful because for me, the whole private credit, these little clubs, these little syndicates, and then you hear what's going on with Vista and they're kind of, fighting with each other because, again, everybody knows who owns the bonds and you can kind of show preference for one club at the expense of another. So talk to us about those dynamics and how that changes the playing field for you as an investor.
Yeah, the dynamics are the same ones that have always been of portfolio construction. It's all about sizing and it's about understanding your liquidity profile. And while, yes, private credit has grown, this concept of figuring that out and how to get out on the right spot on the efficient frontier isn't anything new.
Thank you for joining. This has been wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Told you, conversation today. Told you.
Multi-sector investing barely describes its nuances of piecing together where we are right now, particularly within commercial real estate. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.